This is Left Hand. Hey everyone, thank you for tapping back into Left Hand. This month, my goal was to do two pieces on Dionysus. One, a monologue, which some of you may have heard already. And second, I wanted to do a podcast with a sort of expert on the topic, and that was Keegan Kjeldsen of the Nietzsche podcast. My goal in the monologue was to touch on the mythological precedents of Dionysus and Dionysus's use in psychotherapy and the theory of Dionysus and Ariadne that we get from Gilles Deleuze. In this discussion, we are going to go into some of the historical precedents, more on Nietzsche's Dionysus, and whether or not Dionysus is in exile today. I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the patrons who signed on in February of 2025. Simply supporting my effort to record and archive these discussions for just $5 a month really goes a long way. So go ahead and subscribe to my Patreon if you have been enjoying what you have been hearing. And here's a little bit more of that with Keegan Kjeldsen from the Nietzsche podcast. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, a.k.a. Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast. Hey, why not? Of the Left Hand podcast. We stand alone here today, and I am very fortunate to have with me a guest. It is none other than Keegan Kjeldsen of the Nietzsche podcast, whom we've had on the Acid Horizon podcast in the past to discuss the work of Heraclitus and Nietzsche. And I had the good fortune of being on Keegan's podcast in recent days as we discussed Anti-Oedipus, David Lynch, in the film Eraserhead. But today I have brought Keegan on the show to talk about a shared interest of ours and perhaps a topic that is truly relevant to the age that we live in. Is Dionysus in exile? Who is Dionysus? Do we need to reclaim the power, force, and image of Dionysus in our day? And Keegan is probably one of the podcasters out there in the current milieu of podcasters who's most apt to answer that question. And so, Keegan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And so I'm not sure, well, I'm pretty sure that most of the folks who listen to this podcast right now might know who you are, but in the event that somebody discovers this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, could you just talk about yourself, your background, your relationship to the work of Nietzsche and Dionysus, if you will, and just let us know who you are.
Yeah, so I run the Nietzsche podcast, which is a project that came out of the pandemic years, and not only my long, detailed contributions to the Nietzsche subreddit, but also book clubs that I was a part of, a lot of things that I was doing during that time to pass the time of being in the house most hours of the day. And, as many of your listeners or my listeners may know, I'm also a musician, a touring musician. So that was what was really sort of dominating my life in the decade before the pandemic. And it was partially the lull of that the Nietzsche podcast was born out of. But I think my identity as being a musician first and foremost, and learning philosophy during my time on the road. I mean, I was a philosophy major before I dropped out, but as I've talked about, really my ability, or I would say my education in philosophy was mostly spent on, 8-hour drives from, to Las Vegas from Oregon, reading Nietzsche in the back of the van, right? Because there's no cell service and nothing else to do. And I would bring my philosophy books. Some of the bassists we played with over the years happened to be philosophically interested, and they'd bring their books and we'd trade and read each other's works and stuff like that, or that we brought with us. And I read things that I never would have read because it was sort of being curated by other people. But that experience with music, and with live music, and particularly heavy metal music, as many people have pointed out, has a Dionysian element to it. I think there are some important caveats to that, which I'm sure we'll get to as we talk about this topic. But I always felt very close to the Dionysian. That was actually reading Birth of Tragedy. It was not the first thing I read by Nietzsche. I had read Beyond Good and Evil and a couple other things. But Birth of Tragedy, reading that on tour, I remember when I first read it, it was in 2015. And it was a life-changing text, being exposed to these ideas of Apollo and Dionysus, which I had always heard going into Birth of Tragedy. This is one of the least important books by Nietzsche. It's got all these, we might say, not fully formed ideas. It's polluted with, as Nietzsche says in his own words later, Schopenhauerian formulations, and smells offensively Hegelian at places. And the ending of it is like a Wagnerian screed. And yet, I found it to be one of the most fascinating books I'd ever read, and like a riddle that I was able to sort of work at for many years later, which is the mark of a great book. That's what Goethe says, actually, is like the work that stays with people is the kind that can become like a riddle that they can work at for many years. And so that's sort of my background with Nietzsche. I've been doing the Nietzsche podcast since 2021. It has been more successful, I suppose you would say, than I ever imagined it would. And I think there's a real hunger for content that engages with Nietzsche wholeheartedly, that looks at the whole man, the whole ideas, is not trying to twist Nietzsche into some sort of avatar of my own ideas and my own agenda, and not trying to make it self-help, not trying to read Nietzsche through some other lens. I look at all these other lenses, but I've always had the ethos first and foremost of be a completionist, be honest, and there's no need for me to share the same opinions. That's the other thing. It's like, I have no problem. If you fully self-identify with the person you're talking about, I can imagine it would be a problem, because then you have to start editing and distorting their ideas to be something that you can live with. But if there's something in Nietzsche that I can't live with, I still have no problem telling other people this is what he wrote, and I'm not going to sugarcoat or distort that. And I think that maybe is what's made it very, very popular. And so, yeah, that's sort of how I see the state of the show these days.
Well, I'm going to start with a complete non sequitur. Have you read Laruelle's Nietzsche? Nietzsche contra Heidegger? That might be one that you want to take a look at some point for your show. We actually did a show on it on Acid Horizon, but one of the big takeaways for me with that is Laruelle identifying trends within Nietzsche scholarship as forms of mastery of Nietzsche's work, and how mastery can be problematic in a way, especially with respect to Nietzsche, given that, you know, as you're pointing out, I mean, and even my faves are guilty of this in a way, like Klosowski, Deleuze, and what have you, will identify certain sections, passages, and whatnot, put a kind of lock on that. And there's a risk in identifying Nietzsche with just that certain subsegment of his work, because then it precludes an understanding of everything that's at odds with what we've identified with. And I think there's a broader ethic in there as well with respect to how we read anything and how we pair, you know, readings. For example, like I know you've recently looked at Mishima versus Bataille, for example, as if it's a kind of competition. Like, what if it's a kind of Mishima and Bataille? What is the productive thing that comes out of that intersection? But I don't know if any of that pertains to your relationship with your reading of Nietzsche.
A bit. I mean, I think I brought it up a bit in the conversation we had recently on my podcast, but that I like to, or maybe it was a different conversation. I don't know. It's easy to lose track these days. But I think one of the most important aphorisms in Nietzsche is, it's in Wanderer and His Shadow, and it's called Journey to Hades. And it's about the 8 figures that Nietzsche meets in the underworld. He says, I too have been to the underworld, like Odysseus. And there were 4 pairs of thinkers. He sort of pairs them into, sets of 2. And I did an episode sort of exploring this and why he creates the pairs that he does. But the important thing is that they're all figures that have mutually exclusive ideas. Plato and Rousseau have mutually hostile ideas about the state and civilization and education, and whether those things make man better or worse, right? Mm-hmm. What man in his natural state is like. And yet Nietzsche says both of these, and Nietzsche disagrees with both of them also. Mm-hmm. He probably among the most vehement opponents, or he would say the most antithetical to his own ideas. The most antipodal are people such as Plato and Rousseau. And yet he says, I will accept judgment from them, and I will allow them to judge one another in all things. Because there is something about their standpoint, their perspective, that almost becomes archetypal, you might say, or brings out a true dichotomy. That's another aspect of Nietzsche's thought as well. So that's why I think that passage is very important, because not so much those 8 thinkers specifically. I mean, it's very important for understanding Nietzsche, but for my own life, this notion that comes out very often in Nietzsche, it comes out in The Master and Slave Morality, it comes out in Dionysus versus the Crucified. Deleuze talks about this as well. You know something by looking at what is different from it in some ways. That, and not different, again, you always have to bring this up in that sort of Hegelian negation, where you find that actually they both, that the contradiction between them can be sublated, and that there could be some sort of reconciliation. Realizing that there could be irreconcilable differences between 2 thinkers, where they cannot both be right. And yet there is something that is revealed by contrasting them, and something valuable in calling to mind those irreconcilable differences in various other issues and areas of your life, right? Or of your philosophy. So yeah, I've taken that from Nietzsche. I think that dichotomy is something that is very revealing, and that you might not recognize. I don't want to use the term essence, because I don't think Nietzsche would, but you might not see the character, the sense of something, without seeing what it is that is irreconcilably different from it.
Well, I think that gets us on somewhat to talking about Dionysus and some of the virtues of Dionysus, even what might be called some of the lesser or more unknown virtues, which is existing in the intersection of these kind of polyvalent tensions. Like you're saying, there's something irreconcilable about these 2 figures that I'm attracted to. I'm living in this space. There's no finality. There's no completion. There's no sense of quiet or reconciliation. And I just think it's interesting for those of us who are attracted to philosophy and thought in general, that we gravitate towards this sort of tension, and we occupy it. From one standpoint, it might seem pathological or absurd that somebody would devote their life to standing in that space of really being torn asunder by 2 disparate ideas. But I think the ambivalences that mark Dionysian thinking might be an entry point to the rest of this discussion. So in consideration of the topic here, Dionysus, do we need more Dionysus? Is Dionysus an exile? Just give me your understanding, your affinities with the word and the god Dionysus.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I would say would be just historically, who is Dionysus to the Greeks? And the very brief rundown of that. I mean, everyone will sort of say Dionysus is a god of wine. It's a bit more complex than that. He's a harvest god. And to the extent that he's a god of wine, it's not just sort of drinking as a form of the way that we engage with drinking today. For one, drinking mixed wine with water was very common back then. Wine was a very valuable thing because it sort of was a way for you to not get sick, quite frankly. There's the line in the Gospels even, take some wine for your stomach, my brother. And Dionysus is also the central figure behind these Dionysian rituals, which are the origins of Greek tragedy. And during these rituals, it is drunkenness and it is intoxication, but it's also not a form of intoxication that we really engage in today, which is an intoxication as a means to an end of achieving a state of ecstasy, or perhaps more accurately translated as frenzy, which is a form of, we might say, going out of your mind. So it's one of the 4 madnesses that Socrates lists in the Phaedrus as the Dionysian madness, which is essentially self-forgetting. It's what we might call ego death in the modern day. And, if you've taken a bunch of particularly strong hallucinogens, maybe you've had an ego death experience, but most people don't really have a truly ego death experience when they're simply drinking alcohol. So alcohol was a part of the ritual, but there were clearly some other elements. And what we get from these ancient sources is that people they would be caught up in this frenzy of not just the wine, but also dance, music, and presumably, I mean, at least the Greeks believed, an actual mystical element of the Dionysia, of the presence of a god moving through you. And, Nietzsche wonders in Birth of Tragedy, is it possible for whole peoples to have mass shared hallucinations, to have the same hallucinations? Because he's looking for sort of a physiological basis for understanding the Dionysian. And The other thing we know about Dionysus that's very interesting is that he's the youngest god of the Olympians. And that's likely because he comes from the East and is a product, again, historically, probably of syncretism. In Euripides the Bacchae, he's said to be basically was a secret son of Zeus, as Zeus is always having these secret children, that was hidden from Hera and sent to, I believe, Attis, or basically modern day Turkey, where he is brought up by Cybele, who is an Eastern earth goddess, excuse me. So similar to Gaia and other goddesses like that already existed in the sort of like Western Italian Greek milieu. And that's why many speculate that Cybele worship never really took off in Greece, because they already had Persephone and Demeter and Gaia. But Dionysus is sort of this new interesting figure, and you can look at the sort of like Kybelian rituals and the Dionysian rituals and the imagery associated with him, and it's always piping, drumming. There's a sort of a procession of people with him, and there's always like panthers and tigers and wild cats and leopards and this sort of procession of wild animals that come in with Dionysus. And he's a young, beautiful, androgynous man, often with flower garlands or crowned with laurels, often in this typical Greek fashion, some various states of undress. Sometimes he's playing the lyre or piping himself. The piping imagery more comes when we get this Pan figure, which is actually a much later innovation. Normally, the Romans often portrayed him as bearded, but to the Greeks, he was like a fresh-faced, very androgynous character. And so, the explanation that they had in the Greek myths, I would say, is sort of it's at least perhaps a mythologization of what historically happened, that they received this god from the East. And that happened often with the Greeks and especially with the Romans. And Nietzsche talks about this in Birth of Tragedy. He thinks that the Dionysian, what he calls the Dionysian, which is sort of like, it's hard to describe what we would call it. It's like a psychological force or a social force or perhaps a psychosocial force that can move through the people mimetically and is represented in the figure of this god. But Nietzsche would say it's representing a very real psychological phenomenon that is enacted in these rituals and celebrated and memorialized in these rituals. And that this comes from the East, and that Nietzsche believes in the festivals of Sacaea at Babylon, for example, that they were experiencing the Dionysian. And those festivals involved some of the same things of ritual, madness, dancing, and drinking. It also had a Saturnalian element of masters serving the slaves for a day, prisoners being put to death with full honors of kings and things like that. Sort of this mixing everything up and all of the rules and boundaries. Oh, Nietzsche also talks about there was wife swapping and things of this nature, basically, would go on during the Sacaea and other such sort of ecstatic rituals of the ancient Near East. And this might involve basically the destruction of all boundary lines, that you may need to establish these social, political, religious, moral boundaries. I mean, really, you could see any moral or more as a line that you don't cross. And it's a very odd thing, but it seems that, especially in the ancient pagan world, they would have these rituals where they periodically said, we're going to kind of scrub those away for a day or blur those boundaries for a day. We're going to confuse everything. And perhaps there is an element of that, like we were saying earlier, allows you to recognize the value, to recognize what's happening by holding those boundaries and holding those lines in ordinary life, to see the difference when that does not exist. Mm-hmm. There's any number of potential explanations for where these rituals come from. But the important thing is that Nietzsche thinks, at least anthropologically, there might be evidence that the Dionysian, even though that's the name the Greeks would give it, is sort of a phenomenon that transcends ancient Greece and is actually a sort of a foreign import. But he would also say that it's very important specifically to Greece because it's out of the Dionysia, these rituals where they would engage in this sort of Dionysian self-forgetting. That's where they would first practice the Dionysian dithyramb, which is a spontaneous, poetic praise to the god Dionysus. And it was sort of free form. The rhythm wasn't this regular Apollonian rhythm. It was supposed to be given under the influence of wine. The famous quote from the poet Archilochus, one of the only surviving fragments, I believe, for the playwright Archilochus, is, "I know how to lead off the fair song of Lord Dionysus with my wits thunderstruck with wine. That was the proper way. The wine inspired you, basically, to speak on behalf of Dionysus. And Nietzsche details how this happens. Long story short, over a long period of time, the Dionysian dithyramb evolves into the Greek tragedies that are some of the greatest works of literature that we have from the ancient world, quite ironically in some.
What do you make of the aspect of the Dionysus myth where Dionysus is dismembered by the Titans?
Right. And so that's something that I think it's very interesting to bring in René Girard here and actually his criticism of Nietzsche. That's one story about Dionysus. But in other stories, Dionysus, for example, in the Bataille by Euripides, leads the dismembering effort. He commands his Maenads to dismember Pentheus. And that's a much later play. That's where Nietzsche would have said Euripides was the degeneration of Greek tragedy. I personally don't agree. It's very interesting why Nietzsche says that, and it's important to understand his argument there. But I think the Bacchae is one of the greatest tragedies ever written. But it's reflective of an earlier myths about the founding of Thebes, and it's sort of like tells almost like a refounding of Thebes upon Dionysus coming to the Greek worship. Right? It's the story of how Dionysus came to be worshipped by the Greeks. And his arrival constitutes the destruction of the whole city. And basically it's refounding under a new religious order. That's like the immense importance of Dionysus. But anyway, over the course of that story, he has his Maenads rend Pentheus asunder for not believing in him. So I'm not really answering your question of the Titan story. I just thought it's important to contextualize it because I think that story can be sort of what might we say exaggerated in terms of seeing Dionysus as a direct parallel to Christ or a direct mirror image to Christ, as if he's purely a martyr figure in the Greek mind. But there is something about the Dionysian that's very important. That's sort of like the changing of masks. So that one of the names for actors meant a worshiper or flatterer of Dionysus. And it's because the entire social institution of acting comes out of the Dionysia. And what that involved to the Greeks was nothing like acting today. As Nietzsche says, they deprived them of basically every trick of, facial expression and, the physical appearance of the person. They made them wear a mask, and everything was supposed to be like the force of their oratory, right? And so part of that was supposed to make you, what would you say, lose sight of the fact that it was a real human being, that it wasn't just the mask of whatever one of these great heroes are. But so to return to the Titans question, that is an incident that happens that Nietzsche invests quite a bit of importance into, and that he says the dismemberment of Dionysus was one of the central stories of the Dionysia that they would portray. And that, in fact, the earliest tragedies, Dionysus was always the main character, according to Nietzsche. These were purely religious. It was like a passion play in that way, right? So a passion play is sort of like a modern day play, right? But perhaps you can put on a passion play in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, but you would never put on Jesus Christ Superstar, right? It's a play, but it's for a very specific purpose. It's not for your entertainment, right? It's to mythologize or portray the story of the god. And so Nietzsche's assertion, which does seem to be backed up by what we know anthropologically, is that all of the early stories, so for example, Oedipus, right? That is really a variation on the story of Dionysus, right? Oedipus isn't dismembered by Titans, but the whole idea of the noble god being rent asunder becomes over time a story form where you can see perhaps a noble king or hero. We start to get some variety of that. These are like all different faces or aspects of Dionysus in a way, is perhaps how it might have been originally portrayed. And then over time, they become their own characters, their own separate entities, or so on and so forth. But again, to contextualize all of this, the important thing is that sometimes Dionysus wears the mask of the render, the one who rends you asunder. Sometimes he wears the mask of the one who is rent asunder. And I think that's a very important aspect of Nietzsche's understanding of the Dionysian as well.
I guess there's one more variation of Dionysus that we should contend with before moving forward, which is the Dionysus of the Orphic tradition, who's associated with things like redemption of the human soul, and the undertaking of philosophical practice and attendant ethical practices of the body and so forth as ways of connecting with Dionysus and bringing to bear that form of redemption that was upheld in the Orphic tradition. That looks a lot like Christianity in some ways. So how does Nietzsche navigate around that aspect of the tradition?
Yeah, there's like a soteriology that forms around Dionysus. And I think that that's actually, there's some very funny lines in Heraclitus where he says that what they worship, the one they worship as Dionysus is actually Hades. And I think he's thinking of the Orphics there. So you have to kind of look into more obscure Nietzschean sources to know how Nietzsche would feel about the Orphics. So like his lectures in the Pre-Platonics, philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, and just his materials from teaching at Basel when he was a philologist. He sees, if you take the mythology seriously, Orpheus is like one of the most ancient figures in ancient Greece, right? But it's sort of unclear the timeline of these beliefs developing. And I think Nietzsche would say that it's the 6th century BC where you get these sort of like religious reform craze that goes on in ancient Greece. And it's where you start to get, and here I would follow somebody like Fustel de Coulanges, where originally a lot of the Greek cults, I think you might have worshipped Zeus and Apollo in Thebes, but those words, or let's use the word like Phoebus for Apollo, the shining one. So, we have a Phoebus in Thebes. Oh, we have a Phoebus in Athens. Oh, we have a Phoebus in Argos, right? What Coulanges says is, it's not like they all had one original Phoebus worship that was once a cult that obtained over all Greece, but then they came up with their own versions. He says, no, they use the word for the shining one to refer to the sun because that's like a linguistic product. Like there's a reason why the gods have so many names is that there's a certain number of like natural phenomena that pagans end up worshiping or associating with a deity. And then they use different words for it, but some of them end up using the same words, right? And then they kind of figure out that, over time, once you go from just familial worship to these gens or tribes, and then to the city, and then to these confederations of cities, they start to identify them and say, well, they're actually perhaps the same God, something of that nature. And so what Nietzsche would say is like in the 6th century BC, what starts to happen is you start to get like the Pythagoreans, you start to get all these sort of like movement. I believe Empedocles comes at the end of that century. These really universal religious movements, which is sort of a new thing in Greece. And I guess on the one hand, it might be, maybe this seems like a cop-out or too easy to say that Nietzsche might just say, well, that was just the Orphics Dionysus. Maybe a more elucidating way to say it would be the way that somebody like Empedocles talks about Aphrodite is very different from how Aphrodite might have been understood in archaic Greece. And to explain that, when Empedocles is talking about Aphrodite, he means love, but he's using love to mean a force of attraction that he thinks is like, that you could almost see in like pseudoscientific terms as an explanation for how the natural world, how the various elements combine and come together. Is that he says the reason why it's not just, that originally there are many elements, he's a pluralist, but the reason why they're not all just in complete Anaxagorean chaos, as one of his predecessors would have said, is the force of love, right, is what binds these things together. And that strife that sort of cleaves them apart. And you have these two competing forces. But I mean, before him, you had Anaxagoras, as we mentioned, who talks about the nous, but he also uses Apollo Anaxagoras talks about Apollo in a way Nietzsche says is more like the Germans would talk about Geist or mind, the sort of spirit. And so I think that might be something that's happening with Dionysus in the Orphic tradition, is that moving from these cults that were really, I think trying to, if we follow Nietzsche, and I agree with him, trying to imagize this experience of ecstasy or self-forgetting that they got at least partially from wine and music and dance, which are all the sort of the fields of Dionysus. And he's the one this is the god who makes the grape grow, right? So central to our society. Again, in the Bataille, I believe it's Cadmus who lists off all the 7 different things that wine gives to the Greeks. Very important. And I think, he became a savior figure in the same way that perhaps Mithras did, or any number of other figures that were sort of taken out of a mythology and given a more universal significance, if that makes sense. And because the Orphics, of course, that's a metaphysical cult. I would compare them to the Pythagoreans, even though they arrive at an earlier date than the Pythagoreans. But Pythagoras has a very similar story to that, right? Of he went down to the underworld and emerged again. And he has this divine knowledge now that he can give to his followers, or special revelation that he can give to his followers. So we start to see like cults like this appear that are not just concerned with the traditional pagan propitiation by sacrifices and observance of the rites, but they have a philosophy behind them, you might say. And that's how I would see it.
It's interesting. I mean, just going back to the beginning of your response there, that Heraclitus mentions that the Orphic culture truly worshiping Hades. And I think there's some truth to that. Just thinking back about, and it makes me think too that, the sort of constellation of not only Hades, but the Orpheus Eurydice myth. I mean, there's a lot of resonance there with things we even see in the Old Testament, like the fact that Orpheus looks back, and in doing so looks back, loses Eurydice forever. It recalls what we see in Sodom and Gomorrah a little bit. Like there's that same mythologium is there of losing the loved one who looks back. And so one must live their life in their living life without the one that they can love. And perhaps it's only upon death that there is a kind of redemption. So there is a sort of overlap, like as you're saying, the sort of soteriological aspect that we don't see in the original Dionysus myth.
Yeah, and that's, again, maybe I didn't quite tie that all together, that Nietzsche sees that as part of a what we might call like a social, spiritual, moral development, or even we might call it a development. It's a logic of development, but it leads towards error in a way from Nietzsche's perspective. But that this is sort of what happens when a people begins to philosophize and begins to, and one of the things that Nietzsche says in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks that's very interesting is that philosophy has never healed a sick culture, but it has made healthy cultures even healthier. But if it's practiced by a culture that's already on the decline, it only makes things worse, right? And so he says that it's very interesting when the Greeks began to philosophize, if only they had ended at the right time, right? That maybe they should have quit while they were ahead. That, he sort of sees the history of Greek philosophy as a symptom, a history of the symptoms, of the outward signs of what's going on underneath it. It's in a way, it's a very early Nietzschean text, but it's in a way a very classic sort of Nietzschean point from his mature work of the intellect and philosophy as a sort of the abstract Platonic world, we might say, as a sort of superstructure on an underlying physiological reality, and as the effect, not the cause. And looking at the history of ideas and so he does talk about the Orphics, and he does talk about the Pythagoreans, and he does talk about particularly Empedocles and his cult over the course of, not in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, but in his lectures in the pre-Platonics. And so he sort of sees it as that's like an inevitability as you begin to seek the one, as you try to name the arche and sort of have your intellect take in the whole world and then reflect it in a representation. Eventually you're going to get these universalist religious movements that have very weird ideas. I mean, I keep bringing up Empedocles, even though you didn't ask about him. But I mean, when you think about a culture that sacrifices the burnt flesh of animals on the regular, and then you have this guy come along and say, you shouldn't do that. And he makes a similar point to the Theravadian Buddhists, where he says, we're all reincarnated. That animal could be your great grandfather. You shouldn't eat meat. You'll be a cannibal. At one point, Empedocles sees like a dog being beaten, and he goes and stops it, and he says, I used to know the soul that's incarnated in this dog. He was a friend of mine. So it's like very, very odd, right, that you would get those kind of movements in if you're just looking at the logic of development from the Greek cults before that. And so that's a very, perhaps the insight I'm trying to get at here that Nietzsche points to is a sort of blurring of the lines between philosophy and religion. That modern religion, the conception that we have of religion in the modern age, is sort of inseparable from philosophy in a way that it was not when you just had familial cults, when you're worshiping the hearth fire of your family. It did not have this universal philosophical world-encompassing significance to it, at least from, Nietzsche's standpoint.
We're about 36 minutes in, and we just got through our first question. So, but this is actually this is actually a great time to pivot to the present age and a consideration of the extent to which that Dionysus is operative or inoperative in our world today. And I'll just flag up right at the beginning my interest in George Bataille's work, maybe not as the preeminent Dionysian thinker of the 20th century, but one notable enough with respect to his conceptualization of sacrifice and excess as features of the Dionysian myth, and the way that he has interpreted the evolution of sacrifice and non-productive expenditure as features of social practice, the ways that societies maintain their stability and so forth, that in the capitalist mode of expenditure, for example, at least in Bataille's time, and clearly it has changed today, that the vectors of festivity, sacrifice, expenditure, luxury, wealth, and all those sorts of things were typically enjoyed by the bourgeoisie behind closed doors. I would argue that today that we have, for better or worse, engendered the effects of that kind of expenditure and its character in our consumption as just everyday consumers. I mean, even a working class person right now has like a pretty cool computer, a camera, something like that, maybe even some jewelry, despite the fact that they are still subjected to wage labor and so forth. So I'm curious, we can think politically, we can think economically, we can think ethically and socially. Do you think that in our time today, is Dionysus truly in exile? And if so, what are the forces that have banished him? And what would his return look like?
Yes, I would say that we're not really Dionysian at all in the modern world. Or to the extent that Dionysus exists, it's in little obscure pockets of society that very few people experience. And when they do, they don't really know what word to put to it. And I mean, as for the forces that have banished Dionysus, so I could talk about this from Nietzsche's perspective, at least for a moment. I mean, he would say Christianity is the short answer. It goes all the way back to Socrates and the theoretical approach to life, which sort of attempts to bind the entire world within reason, which is sort of like, it's like the culmination of the project of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Socrates is sort of completes the system of pre-Socratic philosophy in placing all of the world, every problem as solvable, right? Understanding human existence within the narrow band of solvable problems, something like that. And denying the irrational. Socrates is famously anti-artistic. So Nietzsche says it's the Socratic that comes in and kills the Dionysian, so to speak, in ancient Greece and turns it into a theoretical culture. And importantly, Nietzsche says this is not an Apollonian culture. Apollo is the sort of counterpoint to Dionysus, standing for individuation, whereas we might say, to put one word on it, Dionysus might stand for dissolution. Again, you might think Apollo is the god of boundaries. Dionysus is the god of breaking down boundaries, right? But we might also say there's something that's very, Apollo is also a god of the plastic arts, of archery, of music, and of dreams. There is a creative aspect of Apollo as well as Dionysus, but Dionysus is sort of like, he's creative in the way of like, we might say that nature is creative in a very thoughtless, unself-conscious, unartificial way, like a vital force at the heart of nature, right? Which Nietzsche calls a primordial pain and contradiction. And so, but what Nietzsche says is that by the Socratic revolution in thought, the society doesn't become totally Apollonian, because Apollo and Dionysus, he does see them in a sort of dialectic. This is the interesting thing. Yeah, we don't really get a true dichotomy between Dionysus until Dionysus versus the crucified is really a true dichotomy. But Socrates, in a way, isn't even really an opponent of the Dionysian so much as just someone who discounts it and dismisses it and advocates for a life, the good life, eudaimonia, which is purely theoretical. Nietzsche calls this Alexandrian, and it's just sort of named after the period after Alexander the Great, Alexandrian Greece. The Hellenistic period, as they normally call it, where, people will dispute this, but this was the bias, especially during Nietzsche's time. There aren't as many creative artistic works of note during that period. Most of the notable works during the Alexandrian period would be like Ptolemy's Almagest, and scientific works and encyclopedic works, sort of categorizing everything that came before. I once had a conversation with someone who had like a master's degree in the classics, or I forget exactly what, but he was saying he compared it to Simpsons steamed hams memes, like ad nauseum is what's going on there. Everyone knows sort of the cultural language, all of the symbols were all created during the period of Hellenic Greece, what Nietzsche would say was the period of Apollo and Dionysus. And then later they're just sort of riffing on the same things over and over again without really creating anything new, which is very similar to us in the modern day in some ways. Although, people probably always feel that way. But in any case, Christianity, if the Socratic revolution is sort of discounting the irrational for this all-encompassing rationality, which by its very nature sort of makes war on the impulses in a way, tries to dominate the body by means of the mind. Christianity, therefore, is like a further step, the way Nietzsche would see it, as the repudiation of the entire world, the everything worldly and earthly, in favor of an otherworldly good that we will experience after death. But, our God that art in heaven, the kingdom of heaven, right? This thing that's in a metaphysical, imagined reality and that it even transcends reason in this way and moves on to faith, right? Because of the realization that right knowledge is not necessarily followed by right action, right? And that knowledge, reason can't actually be this universal law that can encompass all the world. You may need another world. You may need a day of judgment. You may need some sort of superordinate principle to come and set things right. The world's never going to be, the Socratic faith is it is still a faith, right? The faith in reason and human reason, but that actually lends itself to something that might actually be achieved in life, right? That's the virtue of Socrates. Is eudaimonia is something you can have. Plato's Republic isn't actually realized, but he actually describes like, this is what it would be like, take it or leave it. He has a vision of a society that would be ideal. Christianity sort of says, well, this world belongs to the devil, right? This is the world of the flesh, and there will always be corruption in this world. The accounts are never settled. Like the book ends with the world burning in fire, right? and so to bring this all back, how does Christianity suppress the Dionysian? Well, what Nietzsche says is that it basically attacks all of those physical impulses in the same way that the Socratics did, but in a way it's much more vicious in a sense. We create something that Nietzsche calls the dismal workshop of the spirit. And what that is it's a dance. He says that the Christian lives within an inner dance of guilt and pride. So what Nietzsche attributes guilt to is the discharge of one's cruelty into oneself. He believes that there is a need to discharge your power into the world. And if you're unable to do that, which under the tenets of Christianity, you really shouldn't, right? The gospel says, resist not evil. It says, take no thought for the morrow. It says, sell everything you have and follow me. And the early apostolic Christians did follow this to their credit. And the whole history of Christianity has been people trying to recapture that vibe, right? The Pascal and his sect was all about returning to apostolic Christianity because they recognized look at the Catholic Church during the Renaissance. They're not living like this at all. But in any case, so it's a complete severing of any activity within the worldly and a complete ascetic life-denying ideal is what Nietzsche would say. And so where does your power discharge? Well, it's discharged back into you. And so the short way, I've already been kind of rambling on this, but the short way of putting it is that the guiltier of a person you are, the better you are. Mm-hmm. And so but then, spiritual pride is another thing to feel guilty for. So that's the dismal workshop of the spirit, right? And that's what Nietzsche says has killed the Dionysian in so many words. He would also say Christian pity. He would also say perhaps the Christian exaltation of the truth. That's, we might say, still carries on the faith of Plato, as he says. But that's all really part of this making war upon worldly experience. And to bring that back to Dionysus, there's something about self-forgetting that is active. And that's very important to understand from Nietzsche's perspective. That the reason why the Dionysian is sort of like throwing yourself into life, into real life, is that Nietzsche, it's very interesting to read the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, where Nietzsche sort of begins that essay by talking about, imagine you're standing before a herd of like ruminating cows, right? And he says, man in the modern world who is constantly living in both the future and the past looks at that animal and has a sort of like wistful romanticism for a time when you were not sort of hemmed in by time in a way. And he wants to ask the animal, what is the source of your happiness? And the animal would say, well, every time I'm happy, I forget that I'm happy, but then he forgets to say even that. So he says nothing and continues ruminating, right? And there is a sense in Nietzsche of, what would we say? He's not anti-consciousness per se, but he recognizes the conscious apparatus. I'm kind of using Deleuzian language here, as something which is prone to pathology. It has it's a very recent innovation in the animal kingdom, we might say. And it's prone to, the main one is the inability to let go of sense impressions. And that's the cause of ressentiment, right? Resentment, which eventually leads to the bad conscience. Mm-hmm. And so Nietzsche would say that the Dionysian is like a way of recapturing that natural innocence that's found in forgetting, right? Yeah. So if resentment is, you strike me and I can't let go of that slight against me, we might imagine an animal, a tiger gets into a fight with another tiger, they both break off the fight and then they forget about it. Maybe they remember it, I'm sure they're smart enough to remember incidents like that and adapt their behavior and so on and so forth. But we might at least, arguably, it might be true that the tiger's not being resentful of the other tiger. He's not holding on to that feeling in the same way. And so the immense value of the Dionysian is it allows us to return to that sort of innocent self-forgetting. And Nietzsche says the Greeks, they had a ritual, they had a celebration for their all too human. They would let the sexual impulse leap out in certain rituals, even though they regulated it very strongly in daily life, right? Mm. They would have the Dionysian frenzy where you can sort of let go and give into, he calls it the witch's brew of sensuality and violence, right? In Christianity, none of that is allowed, really, because any attempt by Christian sects to recapture that natural innocence is seen as a denial of the fall of man. So when you had like sects like the Adamites coming from Adam, they basically said, we, by being Christians, can return, being true Christians, we can return to the state before sin and the fall of man. And they believed in free love. They believed in holy nudity. They believed in living in communes where they shared everything in common. They're like, we can recreate the garden on earth. And then there was another sect around Luther's time called the Neo-Adamites that tried to do mostly the same thing. Anytime that happened, the Catholic Church basically said, you have to die now, once they had power, right? So that's what Nietzsche would blame for stamping the Dionysian out of our society. But I would say the important thing is this through line from the Socratics and the theoretical approach to life. That I think Christianity is still a very powerful force in our society. And what I see the two powerful forces doing battle basically in our society nowadays is almost like a resurgence of the theoretical versus the Christian, which it should seem like the theoretical would be an innovation, a beyond. That's how like the new atheists would say, right? Oh, a secular, humanist, empirical, data-driven way of life is a progression. Nietzsche would say, no, that existed 2,500 years ago. And the whole history of philosophy has been a course of degeneration and a course of increasing error. And so it's like almost, you would say that, or I think he would say that much of what's going on today is a sort of like a battle between the theoretical and the Christian. But both of them sort of have a suspicion towards that which is irrational and that which is that self-forgetting, that return to natural innocence.
You kind of stole my next question from me, but perhaps you can elaborate on that, which is, do you see, for example, now granted, we live in the United States where Christianity does hold sway over a fair amount of the population, either nominally or amongst practicing Christians, but to what extent do you see Christian values or degenerated Christian values taking on a secular character? Or what are the ways in which the ressentiment and bad conscience of Christianity in very particular ways infuses something like secular humanism or discourses that we see online that maybe even attack something like Christianity?
I would say that's all over the place, frankly. I mean, I don't know if there's a political movement or any sort of secular movement that's free of those things. And I mean, as Nietzsche would have put it, I mean, there comes a time where we have to pay for having lived under 2,000 years of Christianity. I mean, that is a long time to inculcate values into a people. And oftentimes, I mean, Nietzsche's critique of, I just did a video where I talked about this, Nietzsche's critique of Rousseau is essentially that Rousseau's entire conception of the state of nature is too Christian, right? Like that man has a natural pity, and that, I don't believe Rousseau actually uses the term noble savages, but that man in his natural state, if it's not perfect, right? Rousseau isn't saying it was like the Garden of Eden, but that, anything that you needed to get, you could get with your own two hands, right? You could go drink from the stream if you need to. All the pain and suffering that you might experience in the state of nature, you were adapted to. So it wasn't really that bad, right? Rousseau actually advances that argument. He's not saying it was like idyllic in every sense. He's saying that we were used to it. We were like all the other animals, right? We didn't have a problem with it. And so where was I going with it? Well, so he says that mankind had a natural pity and that there was a natural sense of equality among men, and that people, before they laid down boundary stones and claimed property, would have no reason to hoard wealth or hoard resources and would have freely shared it with one another. Nietzsche's critique of that is that, you've basically internalized all of the Christian morality, and then you've projected it onto what Nietzsche says, like holy mother nature. And so we see this all over the place in the modern world. I mean, I would say you brought up resentment earlier. I mean, how much of our politics is rooted in grievance and vindictiveness, and how much of it is reactive, as Deleuze would have put it. That's the best contribution of Deleuze, is pulling out the active-reactive distinction in Nietzsche, which is there, but Deleuze gives it a centrality that really is elucidating. That a reactive way of life is basically making yourself dependent, is even too soft a word for it. Like sort of like just your life is lived in response, and there's no activity, there's no creativity, there's no vitality there. And that's what I see as the character of so much of the moral world, the political world, the social world today, even when it's rendered into secular language. And I would even say I perhaps have, in some ways, a more forgiving view of Christianity than Nietzsche does, especially, from my reading of those such as Kierkegaard and Jung and Tolstoy and Pascal. I do believe that I can imagine a form of Christianity that is closer to, because Nietzsche has the famous quote, there was only one Christian and he died on the cross. People like Peterson take that and sort of think it was a compliment. It's actually in context. It's really not. He's saying that Jesus was a uniquely pathological individual who was so sensitive that he had an instinctive hatred of reality, and that it was the type of soul who couldn't bear to be touched at all. He says he's the exact opposite of the archetype of the hero. He's the opposite of a warrior in every way. That basically, that's what the imminent kingdom of heaven is the imminent denial of reality as it is. So it's not really a compliment. But I think that there are some who have managed to live that way. I don't think there was only one Christian, right? I think or at least have approximated it fairly well. And I do think that that is a very different, as Nietzsche himself points out, that's very different from the Christianity that came later, that Jesus was completely free of ressentiment. So I'm perhaps a bit more forgiving of that. But then when we look at like the modern, I mean, this is almost like a cliched example, but I mean, like a modern mega preacher and the way they like prey on the despair and hopefulness of their flock, and sometimes with these obscene displays of wealth and like obscene distortions of the gospel, right? Again, sell everything you have and follow me, right? What could be farther from this than, buying like a G6 private jet and wearing, bedazzled suits and things of that nature. And so even then, right, that form of Christianity, there are, we might say, principled Christians who would take issue with that. You could even see that as like a secularization of the bad conscience, ressentiment. But I would just say it's everywhere, that we live in reaction, we live in grievance, and we live in just a theoretical world versus a Christian world is really what that does seem to be the main moral conflict that I often see, is these attempts to either improve mankind, to solve the problem of the human condition, or the people who say it can't be solved. The best we can do is this religious framework, right? Until the day of judgment comes.
I suppose a good follow-up question to that would be then, okay, well, it might be the case that our attempts to organize the world by rational premises have faltered, to say the least, and then have suppressed this Dionysian tendency within us. But if we look back, for example, at even the myths and historical movements that somebody like Nietzsche himself extols in the introduction of Dionysus from the East to the Greek world, clearly the creation or manifestation of Dionysian rituals involves some kind of structuration of those rituals. There's an imagination at work that takes place collectively in allowing us to produce the capacity or the apparatus, to use a Deleuzean word, to exhaust these Dionysian tendencies. This isn't to say that we need a rational structure of Dionysus, but it does, I think, at some level presuppose a sense in which there are communities that are threaded together by a Dionysian thread, or at least could be. How are we to imagine or envision a Dionysian world where we do live in common with one another, where there is this tendency towards cruelty that Nietzsche would see as intrinsic in nature? And how do we deal with that tendency, that reality, given that that is the case?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to answer that. I mean, so the first thing would be, to the extent that I brought up earlier, something like musical communities do have an element of the Dionysian in them. I would say it's like 10% or whatever, just to put an arbitrary number on it, of like the Dionysian experience that you would have had at the mysteries, in ancient Greece. Because usually people are not truly going out of their minds and truly forgetting themselves, right? There's still an element at live music today where people are preening and peacocking and presenting themselves in a certain way. That self-consciousness is inherently reactive, but more importantly, it's Apollonian. You're creating an image of yourself. And image is a very important thing for the musician as well, right? So there is something about the religious aspect of the Dionysia and the secretive aspect of it. So that's another thing about our society today that's very, okay, this is going to seem like a total non sequitur, but I recently watched a movie with a friend of mine who couldn't believe that I'd never seen 10 Things I Hate About You. And so we watched that movie, and there's a scene where the main character, one of the main characters, at a drunken party gets up on the table, and she's kind of like a nerdy girl, and she's a smart kid, and she's a bit rebellious. She gets up on the table at this drunken rager and dances and sort of like twerks, and in a drunken moment loses herself, right? And what we both said was, wow, can you imagine back in the 90s when everyone didn't have a phone and a recording device on them? And people could do that. And not like all the time, but you could have a moment where you're like, I'm going to forget myself. And this image of this persona, which means mask, I'm going to drop the mask and just have an ecstatic experience where I don't care what you think or what you see, or like I'm just moving my body. I'm dancing drunkenly, right? Now, is that going to happen for everyone at every teenage rager party? No, but maybe some people did have that at a time before there were recording devices everywhere, right? And so I think, so step one, if you wanted to like my political program for restoring the Dionysian, we need some sort of ritual space where secrecy is sacrosanct and recording is forbidden, where people can become, once again, like do the things that they did in a pagan ritual and not worry about, you know, where it's not going to like destroy their lives to do so. And I don't know how you would achieve that. I'm sure, you know, this is the thing. Neo-pagan movements are always sort of farcical to me. This is very hard for me to believe that people raised in this modern mechanistic mindset actually believe in the gods. But, you know, if we wanted to have, there was a real value to the religious sense of the sacred. The sacred, you know, it's not just something that it's sacred. I have reverence for it. It's like, there's an element of danger with the sacred and taboo. That the original form of sacredness comes from taboo. From you don't talk about this. This is in a room or a chamber where only we who are initiated go and see and are a part of this, right? And that was true of, say, like the Vestal fires, the hearth fires in ancient Rome, right? Foreigners were executed on a couple of occasions for just hanging out too close to the Vestal temple. Like there's some Samnites or something, and they're like a Roman patrician basically gave a speech and was like, they're trying to put out our Vestal fire, which would destroy our city. You know, they had that level of belief in it, and they're put to death. Like, you know, that was how seriously they took it. So I'm not saying we need to do that, but we need to have a space where people can be Dionysian, for one. And that's the real genius of the Greeks in Nietzsche's view, by the way, is that he says, and I think it's very unlikely that this is actually true, by the way, but Nietzsche says, wherever the Dionysian appeared in Asia, it brought down whole societies and cultures. Like the Dionysian is responsible for destroying Babylon. The Psycheia got out of control, right? That's Nietzsche's account. Again, I don't think that's necessarily true, but he says the Greek genius was that, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing the entire thrust of Birth of Tragedy here, they contained the breaking of all images into an image. They bounded the destruction of boundaries within the ritual boundary of the Dionysia. And by giving that outlet, and he importantly says, so it might, many of the listeners who have not read Birth of Tragedy might think, okay, this is all catharsis. Nietzsche says, no, it's not a catharsis. It's not like, oh, this is built up and I just need to like release it. What he says is that it's an excess. What he means by that is like, how do I put this? Well, specifically with the Greek tragedies, right? It's sort of like a confrontation with, as we put it earlier, the primordial pain and contradiction of existence. And he compares it to, he says, if you stare at the sun for too long, you'll get dark spots on your eyes as a kind of compensation. And so he says the Greeks would stare into the void, and then these bright spots, like the hero of the tragedy, would sort of shine through as a compensation. That it was sort of like by enjoying the excess of throwing yourself into what Nietzsche calls, he says they had a predilection for the horror, the grotesque, and the horrifying. And throwing yourself into that, which is the character of nature from Nietzsche's perspective, right? That there is there's a compensation of being able to bless life by seeing that a figure such as Agamemnon nevertheless lived within this world of tragedy, something like that, of that nature. So anyway, long story short, like that's where I would see we need some sort of bounded ritual space for expressing the Dionysian, for making contact with it once again. And we also need a cultural language for talking about it. And I'm not even sure if the language, like, it's fine for you and me who are into Nietzsche and we're into ancient Greek texts and plays and stuff like that. I don't know if that kind of language is really going to make sense or gain purchase among the general population. And I'm very reticent about coming up with any sort of plan to, like, how do we turn the masses Dionysian? Because I also realize the immense danger in doing that. That's not necessarily something that you want. It might actually be better that they're not Dionysian in some ways, if you have to pick your poison. So, and I don't know the answer to that question, but the main reason why I just think that we're not Dionysian at all is largely having to do with sort of the issue I raised at the beginning, that we are so outward facing and so obsessed with how we are seen in the modern world. And we are so, everything is referred back to questions of pragmatic, as you mentioned capitalism at the outset of this conversation, just as communism is, very theoretical. But basically all the justifications for capitalism and communism, they're not Christian. It's a very theoretical approach to life. Either way, the arguments that are made, it's all from practicality of which is the competition is between who can make the argument for which system or which mix of socialism and capitalism can produce the most wealth for the average person and allow the supply chains to operate efficiently and so on. And so every question is referred back to capital efficiency often in the modern world. And if you want to talk about unbilled expenditure or useless expenditure, that's sort of not even in the modern vocabulary anymore. And to the extent that it is, it's, again, when I mentioned the few areas where I see the Dionysian, it is in artists doing crazy things. It might be in what would be like maybe a right wing or a reactionary example. Maybe somebody like suiting up to go be a mercenary in Ukraine because they just want to fight and be on the frontier again. Or maybe there are all sorts of examples. I mean, I had a friend that I used to work with who I told him I had a couple friends go up and just be fishermen in Alaska. And he was kind of like feeling like his life wasn't going anywhere. He had no prospects. And he said, fuck it. And one day he went up and did that. And I see him every once in a while. He'll come back during like the wintertime and, stop by, tell me how it's going. But it's like a completely different world. And there was something about the decision he made that was like it was like killing his old self and just completely seceding from the world as it was and going out to live, in this harsh but kind of beautiful and very testing environment in a way that, when you're out on a ship for days and days at a time and, you're never fully dry and you're getting misted by these cold, Alaskan winds, and, you can't let go of the rope you're holding or people will fall into the ocean and die. There's something about that that's a bit closer to sort of, if not the state of nature, it's outside of the bounds of ordered society where this is really what gets at it, where you're more in tune with what's happening in your body. You're less running the narrative in your head. This is the reason why, by the way, Nietzsche says a purely Dionysian society, it's not purely Dionysian, purely dissolutionist, purely self-forgetting. The term he uses in Birth of Tragedy is Buddhistic. In an earlier draft, he said Brahmanic, which is very odd because, at first glance at least, because they don't use intoxicants in Buddhism, it's actually forbidden. But you think about self-forgetting and the crushing of ego. That is a very central part of the meditative practice. And it's very interesting that the Buddha says, even in the Pali Canon, that he's sort of talking to the monks, explaining to them, or trying to counsel them against the flood of sensuality. You've committed to leave home and become a monk. How do you fight off these temptations? And he makes a series of arguments about this, but he says, you won't have these worldly pleasures, but you will have the pleasure of jhana, which is meditative ecstasy in so many words. And I'm sure many Buddhists, and they have in the comments section, they've told me that's not the same thing as the Dionysian at all. Of course you would say that. Well, the important thing is that, again, the thing I said, stop running the narrative of who I am and what I'm doing and this ego and this separate thing and blah, 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 blah. You're more in tune with just direct sensation. And I don't want to use the term being in the moment because it's almost, again, a hackneyed cliche, but it is something approximating that. And it is interesting that in some of the Vajrayana Buddhist traditions, they do engage in intoxicants and very weird practices like meditating in graveyards, and even, I think, in some practices doing sexual acts and things like that, but not for the purpose of the pleasure of it, to put yourself into this frenzied mind state.
I'm a little bit stuck on the example of your friend who went up to Alaska to go fishing for life. That's an interesting metaphor, fishing for life. But what I like about the example and the image that you put forward of him on the boat holding the rope, where letting go of the rope could mean his death or the death of others, is that even though what he's doing is a kind of work, he is nonetheless living on the fringe of instrumental reason in some way, by choosing a vocation that is more in touch with that of a kind of pure sacrifice, that when there is an expenditure, it accrues to nothing. He's in the ocean. That's it. That's the end of the story right there. But also, too, something that you touched on, you talked about this kind of fight club for twerkers, which I thought was interesting. Twerk club. If it's your first night at twerk club, you must twerk. Do not talk about twerk club, but also no recording, too. One of the things that we tried to do in our book, Anti-Oculus, was survey a whole conceptual arc of what it means to be perceived and recognized, recorded, not only as a feature of modern surveillance, but also in terms of the kind of discreteness that we demand of ourselves and of each other in terms of identifying ourselves as a subject. And just today, I had a meeting with somebody, and we're discussing a creative project that I'm about to launch. And what she said was, interestingly, is that in high school these days, there are now Luddite clubs. I have yet to look this up, but it's very interesting to me that one of the premises of these clubs is ways that students can not only extricate themselves from, the influence of technology, but of recording itself, and to engage in processes of image capture and recording that are more thoughtful, deeper, sensuous. So often these Luddite clubs, based on what she said, are also like old school photography clubs. Like, instead of going out and taking pictures on your phone, actually learning how to develop an image and being a bit more thoughtful of that. And with respect to Dionysian politics or Apollonian politics, just the absolute democratization of our surveillance society, insofar as people are using their phones to record other people using their phones on airplanes and things of that nature. And that itself sort of comprising this broader circuit of dopamine trigger in the collective, and also the kind of the sense of guilt and resentment, or just the kind of bleh feeling that one gets from just being utterly immersed in something so inane and vacuous as just Instagram reels all day long. And the sense that our power is not exhausted in a way that is deeply satisfying by being caught up in these circuits all the time. Is there a way to connect the recording piece to the myth of Dionysus itself? Is there a way to connect this theme of anti-surveillance perhaps to the ancient myths of Dionysus?
Yeah, well, it did strike me as you were just saying it just now. I guess, well, to first refer it back to something in Nietzsche, if ressentiment comes from the conscious apparatus's inability to let things go, to let go of past sensations, then a society of total surveillance and recording is like that on a macro scale, in a way. And there was a very interesting video that kind of made the rounds on like Facebook and Twitter a couple months ago, I believe, where it was somebody, I guess, presumably with just a camcorder in like the early 2000s, walking around a high school, filming people. Nothing really remarkable in the video, but people were, it was one of those things that just sort of went viral because people were very interested in the fact that, of the way people acted on camera, and the fact that you could tell there was a novelty to being filmed. People would kind of like shyly wave at the camera and smile for the camera, and that still in some ways say and do things where they were quote unquote being real in front of the camera, right? And the conclusion that many drew was that this was right before we were about to be subjected to this onslaught of, as you put it, the democratization of surveillance, where they hadn't been trained yet to act a certain way on camera. It was still like a new, interesting thing. And it wasn't something that felt oppressive as it does to many people today. And with the knowledge that, if you're having a freak out in public, you're having your worst moment, people are going to film you and it could be seen by millions of people. No one had had that experience yet at that time. And so people weren't scared of the camera. And so it's not that people are scared of being filmed in the same way today, but you can see people, when they know they're being filmed, they kind of put their face down. And it's not just the phones. I mean, you have Ring cameras on pretty much every doorbell in America now, in suburbia at least. And it's a tough thing because it's hard to argue that you shouldn't have one. Like, it's a real prisoner's dilemma, isn't it? Because on the individual level, it's very good to have one. But on the social level, you look at the entire picture and it's like, okay, we've just handed over complete surveillance of every street in this country, every residential street, to a private corporation. That's probably giving it to the surveillance state, or definitely is. And also doing whatever they want with it. Who knows what information they want to glean. And it's not just direct surveillance being captured in terms of video. It's also your preferences, your shopping preferences, what your eyes linger on most likely when you're looking at something on your phone. And so, yeah, it's pretty all encompassing. And to refer it back to the Dionysus myth, I think, again, a lot of the myths, not only do the rituals take place in secret, there used to be, Byung-Chul Han actually might be an interesting person to bring into this discussion, that there is a real value to privacy and secrecy and being able to have a place for your shame and your embarrassment that's not beheld by the public eye all the time. And the fact that, so I don't really know anything directly in the myths about, that I could necessarily relate to surveillance, just so much as I would return to the idea that there was a real value to having secret rituals and practices, or just that we're not, the fact is, we still, with the Eleusinian mysteries and the Dionysian mysteries and the mysteries concerning Persephone and Demeter, people will speculate, but we still don't know the total content of what they did and what they believed and what they said. We have some, but it's very sketchy and we don't know how much we're missing. So it's one of those unknown unknowns, as Rumsfeld, the great philosopher, once put it. So there is and that I think is incredible, right? And we don't have a conception of that with our religion now either, right? Religions that have secret beliefs are kind of like seen as cults, which I suppose they would be. But, that's always like a suspicious thing. And in fact, the only religions in modern American life that have secret knowledge are sort of ridiculous. They're not only oppressive and generally considered to be dangerous and harmful by most people who aren't members of them, but they're also seen as somewhat ridiculous, and that would be Mormonism and Scientology. That's who has secret beliefs that you only get to hear about as you move up in the hierarchy of it. So that's sort of our conception of, again, to bring in Byung-Chul Han, we've sort of been trained to view secrecy as bad. We've been trained to see transparency as always being a good thing, and honesty and vulnerability. That's a big problem I've had with the left-wing culture, is this love of vulnerability, I think, can be very harmful, because no, you shouldn't always be vulnerable. And often the way that the harmful cults do prey on people is by getting them to be vulnerable and then using that material against them. Again, bring in something like Scientology. And so I think we need to return to an ethos of privacy again, if we want to recapture the Dionysians we're talking about, if that's what your goal, right? The problem for that is that I don't see how it happens. But as Ice-T said, I'll give up my gun when everyone else does. That's kind of the situation you're in, right? And from a theoretical perspective, by the way, if we're thinking about it Socratically or Platonically, as most people do, why would you want to bring back the Dionysian, right? It's very hard to make an argument for it, other than the fact of like, uh, you know, directly and immediately throwing yourself into life in the most beautiful and ecstatic possible way. I guess I can't put a price tag on that or explain what that will lead to socially in terms of progress or whatever. I'll just say it's the, it's might be the meaning of life, but I can't tell you, can't tell you in terms of capital efficiency what it's going to get you. So it's a very hard argument in some sense to see how we return Dionysus to the modern world. And this is maybe why Nietzsche can be read as an existentialist, can be read as speaking directly to the individual, that you have to figure out a way to recapture the Dionysian or rediscover Dionysus in your own life. Because if you want to sort of create some sort of Dionysian project in society, you're cutting against the grain of these like universalist, pragmatic, mechanistic, again, or capitalistic theories of how society should run.
Maybe one last question to finish up here. I don't know if I introduced this book to you. Maybe you saw it on the timeline when I posted it ages ago, but it is Dionysus in Exile by Rafael Lopez Pedraza. He's a depth psychologist in the Jungian tradition, and he's making very similar arguments to the ones that are being made here today. But one of the things that he points out about the Dionysus myth and the sort of attributes and figures of Dionysus, one is that there's kind of ambivalences there, which we all know about. But one of the ambivalences that often gets overlooked, that he argues, is that while Dionysus is upheld as this figure of revelry and excess, one of the counter attributes, if you will, is that he's also the figure of stillness and calm. And that within the figure of Dionysus, there's a sense in which one incubates their powers, or they can utilize withdrawal as a way to, well, if we think about psychotherapy, for example, being analyzed is a kind of social withdrawal, in the sense that you have the analyst and analysand in a room and you're working on a problem as if it were a laboratory of sorts. Maybe some of that applies to what we're talking about with secrecy here, but I was wondering if this is something that in your own research on Dionysus that you've come across. Some of the authors that he mentions, by the way, one is E.R. Dodds, who I've looked at before, but also W.C.K. Guthrie, whose work I don't know that well, primarily because I'm just not working in this kind of literature all the time. But I wonder if you could speak to, what happens after the excess has been had, or is there a necessity for, constructing a place of repose, in as much as there's a need to construct a place of secrecy where this kind of excess unfolds?
Yeah, after the excess, what happens is a cigarette. And a long sigh. No, what I'm reminded of is the way Nietzsche basically says that the way that the Greeks dealt with, the way that they calmed their passions was through excess. And that it was by making the particular drive or impulse that was vehement and demanding discharge. It's maybe just because I mentioned smoking, but, most people have probably who have seen King of the Hill, know the episode where Hank catches Bobby smoking. He makes him smoke a whole carton of cigarettes. And that was an old school thing that some people from perhaps the boomer generation, their parents would do, right? I'm going to make you do this so much that you don't want to do it anymore. Or Homer Simpson in Hell. You like donuts? Here's all the donuts in the world, right? But so Nietzsche actually says that that's what the Greeks were doing, not maybe consciously that was their goal, but that was to the extent there's a social utility of excess, that it was like making the impulse burn itself out to where it's almost like disgusting to continue. You've so fully indulged that you just can't bring yourself to indulge anymore. And that will always be far more effective at controlling an impulse than wagging your finger at people and telling them that it's wrong, or that it doesn't make rational sense, or any of these other things that, to the extent that Nietzsche thinks society does manage to get people to regulate their feelings with thought, it's by creating this regime of punishment, or that they remember that, if I do this, I'll be punished. And that's how we develop our memory and all that. But he thinks that in general, making these sort of like pragmatic moral arguments, or even arguments like from Christianity, right? I mean, I bring up this quote a lot, but it's one of the best ones, where Paul says, "To will is present with me, but how to do good I know not. For the good that I would do, I do not, and the evil that I would not, that I do." And so this is like the saint who creates Christianity, and he's basically saying, sometimes I sin, I can't help it. I just the the devil takes me over, right? It's the devil in the flesh. And so it's always very ineffective to the whole moral regime, is the way Nietzsche sees it. And so there is like an actual, what would he say, like practical argument that Nietzsche sees in returning to the Dionysian, returning to the public sanction of occasionally, and in the right context, being as excessive as possible. They had the Eleusinian mysteries like once a year. So it wasn't, people will talk about it like, well, the foundations of Western civilization. I think Joe Rogan said this, like it is hallucinogenics in wine. It's like, well, we don't exactly know what they were taking, for one, but also they weren't like eating mushrooms every weekend, right? This was something that they did excessively once, right? Once a year. And hopefully to such a degree that the impulse then burns itself out, so to speak. And so that's how I would sort of associate with the calm of Dionysus. And there are all these sort of, what also came to mind, which might just be sort of free association, sort of the imagery in Julian's speech in The Secret History by Donna Tartt, where he's talking about the powerful mysteries of Dionysus, of honey bubbling up from the ground and wine flowing from the rivers and things of this nature. That the sort of like majestic, magical image of nature, not necessarily an image of Dionysian frenzy, but sort of getting lost in this sort of serene, magical idyll of nature, which is also a part of the Dionysian. So that's how I would sort of look at that issue of like the calm, the stillness, the perhaps even a reflection afterwards. And that's the troublesome thing about the Dionysian, is that you can't really grab hold of it, because if it truly is a loss of self-consciousness and a total throwing yourself into self-forgetting, there's no way you can remember it, right? You'd only have like sort of at best, the haziest inkling of what has happened. But
yeah, maybe just one more thing on that. Some research that I did for a chapter on Nietzsche that never got published had to do with rest and repose in Nietzsche's works. And I was drawn particularly to two areas. One is in The Wanderer and His Shadow, where there's the passage about noontide. And then, of course, we have the passage on noontide and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And one of the interesting things about the image of sleep put forward in both of those places is that Nietzsche takes a nap at noon, right? Or Zarathustra takes the nap at noon. And if you look at some of the mythological imagery associated with noon, noon is the hour of Pan, and Pan is often a rural instantiation of the figure of Dionysus. And it's interesting to see that one of the things that Nietzsche wants to fend off is this notion of sleep as being lulled into a kind of unconsciousness. Nietzsche sees sleep as like a true power nap, in the sense that it takes you to the very bottom of the abyss, where one regenerates one's powers and gets launched back out again. I'm curious if you had any similar observations with respect to the way that Nietzsche views rest and repose in his work.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that passage, which I believe is just called At Noon, is Zarathustra says, "At this moment, the world is perfect." And noon is also, in the language especially of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is often associated for Nietzsche with like the high point of humanity, or the midpoint of humanity, right? It would be the high point of humanity and the midpoint at the same time, because at the sunset of humanity is the overman, right? The dawn of the overman. And that's when the sun goes under, humanity goes under. But so the high point of humanity, the zenith of humanity, is when we're sort of halfway towards becoming something. We're well on the way to becoming something better than ourselves. And it's at that point that Zarathustra says, I'm going to take a nap. It's the opposite of activity, right? As you point out. But that that line, at this moment, the world is perfect. I think, for one, that's very much tied in with Nietzsche's amor fati and his acceptance of the world as it is, and his refusal to condemn the world on the basis of the fact that it doesn't measure up to like whatever moral or idealistic standards we may have for it. And simply to say, yeah, it might be horrifying, it might be grotesque. Nature has all sorts of aspects of it that are quite terrible, we might say, from the human perspective. But we are a part of that world, right? We are a part of that primordial pain and contradiction. And it is the way things are. It is by necessity that things are that way. And if you got rid of all the pain, by that same token, you might get rid of all the pleasure in existence as well. Nietzsche ponders sort of those thoughts. So there's a very deep sense of acceptance in Nietzsche, or even embrace. Acceptance is too soft of a word, that he really wants to say, I want to affirm and embrace the world. Everything that is necessary about the world is what I want to embrace. And that's something that I think is very much missing from both many people who take Nietzsche in a political direction, particularly people who use him as part of this like culture war, like right-wing culture war, which is very much fueled by grievance. And I suppose you could make the same argument against like some Nietzschean Marxists, but I won't delve any more deeply into that. Is that there just seems to be this missing element of that at the end of the day, or I guess in the middle of the day, Nietzsche is saying the world is perfect, really. Like there's no problems, right? There's these problems that you have. There are problems in your conscious mind with how things ought to be, but that's not real. And I think most of our philosophy and our moral aims, things like that, it's all constitutes this long struggle against reality. And the flip side of that is that Nietzsche is not going to say don't struggle against reality, right? Because that's what it means to be alive, is to be arbitrary, be different, be at war with what is different from you, or from, like on the biological level, right? Of different organisms struggling for the feeding ground or struggling against one another. But that conflict, that inevitable conflict, is not a source of condemnation of the world for Nietzsche. And so I think that's very important in sort of understanding this. But I think the other element in that passage is leisure, and the fact that Nietzsche is a pro-leisure philosopher, and that means a pro-rest philosopher. He's not one of these hit the grind set kind of philosophers who thinks that work is good for you. In fact, he thinks labor is bad for you in many ways, and that the best thing is to be someone who has the privilege of having leisure time. And that's a lot of his problem with socialism, by the way. And it's something the socialists should think about, that Nietzsche basically has this model of society that some people have to work, and so that a parasitical class can have leisure time. And the reason why that's good is because in that leisure time, they can create art and culture. And basically, those things are what we were talking about earlier. They're Dionysian in the sense that it's useless expenditure, really, at the end of the day. I mean, again, from the angle of like innovating science and technology, you can see it as like being progressive. But like, what does Michelangelo's David do for me? What has he done for me lately? It's a pretty thing to look at, but what is it other than that? And that is a very theoretical way of thinking about it, which I think I'm not going to make a rational argument for why that's wrong. We all know it's wrong. We all know that useless expenditure is, on some deep level, we all know that it's actually the best thing in life. And so Nietzsche's point that I think modern socialists should contend with is, what he's really afraid of is a world where we say no one has leisure time. We're all going to divide all of the labor duties, and now we're all a laboring class. And maybe it's a little easier on us than it was before because everyone has to do it. But we're going to take, we'll do what the Maoists did and take the emperor and force him into a labor camp to make him better. And Nietzsche would say that didn't make him better in any way. On the other hand, from my perspective, I look at what the emperor was like, who's a completely worthless person who didn't have any skills. And he wasn't being made better by a life of total leisure either. So, take Nietzsche with a grain of salt, as I said at the beginning of the conversation. But there is, I guess what I'm just trying to get across here, there is something in Nietzsche where he would sort of say the real expression or manifestation of your gratitude for just being alive in the world and accepting, embracing the world as it is to have that moment of leisure where you say, you know what, there's nothing to be done. The world is perfect. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that's a good thing. And should a world where man doesn't have that is like a horrifying outcome to Nietzsche, right? And I think it should be horrifying to all of us. So then how do you work that into your goal, whatever it may be, assuming your audience, probably a left-wing goal, largely, where you take account of that? Like, guys, leisure is good. Like we don't need this Soviet fetishization of the work will make everything all better. And so it's like, I just wanted to, it's a helpful thing to contextualize Nietzsche's opposition to socialism in those terms. Like, what's really at the bottom of it is that he is a great thinker of odium, of leisure time. And that's where everything great happens, really, from Nietzsche's perspective. And so I think that's largely what he's talking about in that passage.
Yes, and I think for the left-hand audience and the Acid Horizon followers, that's a pretty easy sell given the sort of left-wing politics that we have, to be fair. But, another quick connection to make there, it's just nice to always have somebody to bounce these ideas off of now and again. But seeing the image of Nietzsche at rest at midday, it is this sort of extreme image of the utter excess of solar power, the sun splashing down all of its energy on the completely resting body, one completely devoid of guilt, bad conscience. And what I really appreciate about it, this image, which I just noticed now for the first time, you talked about the sun setting as being symbolic, perhaps in some sense of the Übermensch, whereas the sun rising, of course, could be ape or man, if you will. And that being in this interregnum or at this median space is by no means a reason to disavow life. I mean, think about those who maybe see themselves as imposters, epigones of history, living in an interregnum with no significance. There is still a great refulgence in life itself, at any given moment. And I think this is one of the lessons of Nietzsche, is that no matter how down and out your day and age may be, there is great power in the affirmation of life at the end of the day. But
yeah, I mean, Nietzsche could have only written at the time when he did.
Right.
And
exactly.
That is another aspect that's sort of what I was trying to bring out in criticizing the romantic return type people, whom Nietzsche explicitly condemns, by the way, that it's, not being at home in the world that you actually live in and projecting onto an imagined past or an imagined future. It's sort of like Nietzsche is always on guard against trying to justify life by projecting into the past, into the future, into heaven at some later time or other place or another dimension or something like that. That's when all the accounts will be settled and everything will be made right. And in some sense, that is the main thing that he struggles against. And that's a point that Peter Sloterdijk makes at the end of Nietzsche Apostle that I think was very, very prescient, because he brings that up at the end of that speech that he gave, that he later compiled into the essay, of sort of that scene at the end of, or at one point in Zarathustra, that of Nietzsche at rest, and pointing out that how undervalued that aspect of Nietzsche is, and how you really need that acceptance, that embrace, and that moment of saying, of being at, see, Nietzsche, I hesitate to say at peace because we're talking about Nietzsche, but being, we might say, invigorated by the fact that you live in a time that, as Mao would say, there is chaos under heaven. The situation is perfect.
And with that too, just the idea of the complete and unfiltered force of the sun being drawn down on a body that's resting in utter equanimity is an image that we can return to, and one completely at an interregnum in its own becoming, and still utterly affirmative of itself. I think it's a beautiful image, but with that said, of course I knew we were going to go like almost 2 hours. Here we are at the hour and 45-minute mark. But anyway, Keegan, tell us here's what I want to do. I really appreciated your recent episode on Jordan Peterson, the sort of takedown and dismantling of the notions about Nietzsche that Jordan Peterson puts forward. You do so in such a eloquent and systematic way. I'll go ahead and link that in the show notes. So if people want to hear more of you, that's probably a good way that they can get into you. But is there anything new that you're working on now? I know you have a book that we've promoted in the past on Acid Horizon, but what's in store for you for the rest of 2025?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll plug the book again because it's called The Ritual Madness of Rock and Roll. And it's a combination of my philosophical memoir, or it's a combination of like a memoir about my tour through Europe with my old band 6 years ago now, and a series of philosophical investigations into aesthetics. So if you liked all of the things we're talking about, you'll probably enjoy that book. And it gets into a lot of those topics. And I'm sort of asking the question, what is art? What is it good for? And funnily enough, that does tie into what I'm working on now, because what I have forthcoming is an episode on Tolstoy's What is Art? It's a philosophical essay by Tolstoy. And very interesting that he wrote that when he was 76 years old. So like many of us, he was able to do art without knowing what it is, and write War and Peace and Anna Karenina without really understanding it, right? You know, that's what artists usually do, is that we insensibly create art. And then later we go back and kind of wonder, what is it that we're really doing? What is the value of art? So I'm doing an episode on that. I'm also working on an episode on Protagoras and the Sophist school and rhetoric, and particularly Nietzsche's lectures on rhetoric. And I look a bit into Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, which is it's a topic that fascinates me because I would consider myself in some ways a modern day sophist. I very much am enthralled with Nietzsche's understanding of rhetoric and the importance of the school. And so, and after that, we're going to return to, we kind of do book walkthroughs on the channel. And I've been taking the gay science in pieces, and this will be book 3 of the gay science coming up. That'll begin with the first time Nietzsche says God is dead, or actually he starts out by saying Buddha is dead, which is funny. And so that's sort of what I'm working on. Those are the forthcoming episodes I have coming out. I've also got a book that it's basically been finished, and I don't know why I'm holding on to it. I think I'm waiting for the right time, but I've got a book on Nietzsche and his view of the Greeks. And I tried to write a comprehensive text of explaining all the aspects of Nietzsche's thought that on the ancient Greeks, basically. And so that will be coming out, who knows when. But that's what's going on with me.
Yeah, we'll be listening. Well, Keegan, want to thank you once again for coming on. We'll probably have you back on this show or Acid Horizon sometime in the next months.
I'd love to. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.